Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Greenlining Institute's Racial and Economic Justice Summit. It's great to see you all here today. And you are in the Reparations breakout session discussion. So you're in the right place. So we're going to get started and bring up our panelists in just a moment. The purpose of this panel is to have a conversation about how government, foundations, and nonprofits can work together to help close the racial wealth and health gaps for Black families through reparations in California. And we're particularly intrigued by this conversation because of the recent creation of the task force to study the impact of reparations for Black households. My name is Kelsey Lyles. I'm a racial equity program manager at Greenlining. And I will be joined here today by Pacolia Manigo from Bay Area Plan, Jesse Van Tol from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and also Michaelia Davis from the Surdna Foundation. And I believe Malik will now bring folks to the stage, which is wonderful. Hello, everyone. And before we jump in, I will provide a few more grounding remarks to kind of help facilitate our conversation today. So we want to acknowledge that there are many different definitions, types, and understandings of reparations. And this is certainly a very hot topic right now. It seems like there's a lot of articles and buzz about this, both at the national and local level. As an equity organization, the Greenlining Institute is really excited to see the momentum behind reparations, specifically as a pathway for implementing race-conscious and race-specific policies, even with the potential barrier of Prop 209. Greenlining has two legislative priorities this year with an explicit focus on racial equity. These include SB 17, which was introduced by Senator Pan, and it's an effort to create a statewide Office of Racial Equity for California, and also House Resolution 39, which was recently introduced by Assemblymember Gibson, which would encourage the legislative branch of government to include equity impact statements in bill analysis so that there are more data points on the impact of bills for marginalized communities. So we see both of these policies kind of working together to institutionalize racial equity and help create more precedents for race-conscious decision-making in alignment with this additional task force that's forming to study the impact of reparations. I've personally been enjoying reading the Reparations Toolkit, which is put together by the Movement for Black Lives. And one of the definitions it provides that I like to offer for us to consider is that reparations are a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. But to put it very simply, reparations are the act of making amends for a wrong. And this toolkit also acknowledges that there are a lot of different types of criteria that could be considered when creating a reparations agenda. For example, a reparations policy may include, and importantly include, acknowledgement of the harm of racism, compensation to a specific defined group of individuals harmed by a violation, action to restore individuals harmed to the position they were in before the harm occurred, action to stop the systems, institutions, and practices causing the harm, and also changes to laws, institutions, and systems aimed at ensuring the harm will not happen again. And I think as advocates, it's that last piece in particular, those changes to the laws that we're really excited to explore with other organizations as this task force forms. Also, before we dive in, it's like to quickly acknowledge that, the data points are very clear and make the case for why we need specific interventions to promote healing and prosperity for Black families. Research shows that today the average Black family has 1/10 of the wealth of the average white family. In 2019, data shows that 31% of Black children were born into poverty. Also, despite representing only 6% of California's population, Black people account for 25% of the state's jail population and 29% of the prison population. Also, when thinking about the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, nationally, Black people are about twice as likely than white people to die from COVID-19. And we know that these differences and these inequities are preventable. They are unfair and they're also unjust. So we see the intersections, we see that there are many data points across different sectors, from education to health to employment to housing to incarceration, that really show that these inequities that stem from slavery and white supremacy can be corrected through policy change as one arm. So let's go ahead and dive into the discussion. I want to kind of ground us in the thinking that it's really important to move past the moral or the philosophical argument for reparations and put these concepts into practice and to action, so that we can not only close the racial wealth gap for Black families, but also begin to promote more healing and repair the harm and trauma from structural racism. We're going to start the conversation today with a conversation with Pacolia, who is the Executive Director of Bay Area Plan. And Pacolia, your organization led a collaborative campaign for reparations for Black students that led to a resolution being passed by Oakland Unified School District, which is amazing. For those in the audience that may not know, over the past 2 decades, Oakland Unified School District has closed 16 majority Black schools, forcing more than 18,000 Black students out of the district. The reparations campaign called for repairing harm done to students, investing in reparations for Black students and Black families, and also transforming community schools to center the experiences of Black students. And our first question is, when it comes to that aspect of centering the experiences for Black students, can you share with us how anti-Blackness was showing up in education equity policies or politics in Oakland?
Absolutely, and good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you grounded us in kind of the big thing that Oakland has avoided a conversation around for a while, which is kind of the effect of the policies, right? So 18,000 Black students and their families have been pushed out of Oakland since 2004, and that's a huge number when you think about only 8,000 are left in our city, right? And then when you look at the experience that those 8,000 Black students are having, what we hear from them directly is that they feel like folks don't care. They feel like that the moment they walk on a campus, that they're seen as a threat. They feel like there's a significant level of bias in the teaching. They feel like they're not safe. They feel like they are having an experience that is quite different than their peers. And when we look at the data, it actually backs up what Black students are saying. They are 7 times more likely to be suspended. They are 5 times more likely to have interaction with police in our city. And we know that those 2 points alone are a huge indicator of what their future life experiences will be, right? And some folks say, well, why do you look at that piece of the work? Well, let's go back to even preschool. So many of our Black students do not even get access to preschool. So then we're looking at the birth to 0 world, with 25 to 30% of our Black students not even getting access to a strong foundation in our city, right? And so we bring all those things into this perspective because when we're looking for the policies that help create those conditions, we're looking at the investment, right, that our city, that our county, that our school districts are making in regards to Black students, and we don't see that investment. We see them doing what is necessary by compliance means, meaning let's comply with the state says, let's comply with what the federal government says when it comes to low-income students. But unfortunately, here in California, because we did not win, unfortunately, the case of Prop 16 in November, to undo Prop 209, which really prevented so much of what's necessary when it comes to Black students, the centering of Black students and race as a core component of policy. We're still seeing so many policies that cannot be undone. Namely in OUSD, we see the blueprint policy as a huge, huge challenge to anti-Black racism in this system being undone. For those that don't know, the blueprint policy is a policy that mandates that the superintendent propose school closures or co-locations or mergers so that the district can, quote unquote, right size its budget. We also hear that particular narrative here in Oakland, that Oakland does not have the capacity to or the ability to run the school district without closing schools, and that it's fiscally insolvent. Which is a narrative that has existed since the 90s, since OUSD was really put under state receivership. And so we're looking at how that policy has such a significant impact on what OUSD is doing when you're trying to right size your budget and you continue to close majority Black schools. The community can come to no other conclusion than you will balance your budget on the backs of Black students. And that creates a culture, a condition, a foundation in our system that tells Black students and their families that essentially you don't matter. We'll close your schools whenever we want to. We'll do whatever we want to with our budget. Even if there's money that says that we're supposed to spend it on you all, we're not going to do it unless the law says we have to. And so we're grateful for the amazing listening sessions we were able to do as part of the Justice for Oakland Students Coalition to really come to the table with Black parents, Black students, educators, principals, staff across this whole city, and really begin to just have a conversation around how anti-Blackness is showing up. And there were some really amazing solutions lifted up, but there was also a lot of pain. And so we were able to easily connect this campaign to the first step that we believe reparations calls for, which is acknowledgement of the harm, the acknowledgement that the current experience, the past experience, and the future experience, unless we decide to interrupt it, will always be around anti-Blackness, because that is what people are saying, right? When they lift up the bias, when they lift up the not feeling safe, when they lift up not feeling heard or seen, those experiences require us to then look at policy solutions, and that is exactly what the reparations for Black students resolution is. It is 15 demands that Black students, parents, educators develop by just naming how anti-Blackness showed up in the system and thinking through solutions. And so when we hear this narrative that you cannot create systems change because it's just impossible, we push back against that, and we say reparations can be grounded in a reality around pushing for policies that focus on systems change. And this policy seeks to make our district not only center Black students, but begin to connect the compliance pieces that we know they should be doing with actually thinking outside of the box, thinking outside of a strategic plan, and thinking outside of a narrative that, oh, we can just do what we can do. We'll just roll it out in incremental steps. And so we're really pushing for the existence of a commitment that OUSD close the opportunity gap, because that is exactly what it is. It is a gap in opportunities. We know that the Hills families have a significant amount of opportunities from birth on that many Black students and Black families do not have in the flatlands. And we asked OUSD to make a commitment to close that gap by 2026. So that's a 5-year commitment. And we thought that that was really critical. We wanted to go for maybe 10 years. But we settled for 5 because we wanted something that could stay in place beyond one superintendent or one school board or even one set of administration. So I'm so excited about talking about this. I can go on and on, but I'm sure there's so many questions.
That was wonderful, and congratulations on the success of your campaign. It sounds amazing. It's a great example of this happening in real time at the local level. I do have another question for you. This one is a little bit philosophical. And this is something that's coming up in a work group that Greenlining is forming with different advocacy organizations that are Black-led and interested in a potential campaign in the future on reparations. So this question is, some would argue that we need reparations immediately for all descendants of people impacted by slavery. And others may believe that in order to make reparations a reality, to your point about some of that incremental change over time, we may need to focus our efforts for the most marginalized amongst the Black community first. In your opinion, or in your experience doing this work, do you think we need to have an equity lens, so to speak, even within these reparations conversations?
You know, so one of the things that people will definitely hear from me is I think we use equity we overuse the word equity in some ways, right? So for me, what I'm hearing, the question, and I'll relate it to the campaign, is, do we need to differentiate and prioritize who is at the forefront of the conversations around reparations? And I would say yes, we do. Right. I have the privilege of being an executive director. My base, my constituency, to who I'm accountable to, who we are accountable in this campaign, do not have access to the same opportunities. Even though we're all Black, they don't have access to the same opportunities that I have. Right. My knowledge, my skills, my experiences make me able to navigate through systems in a very different way. Make it possible for many of us who have full-time jobs in this pandemic to have had a different experience than many folks in our community. After experiencing this last year, absolutely feel like we have to have the conversation around the experience. I have watched Black folks be turned away from hospitals. I have watched in this last year folks be completely degraded down to having to show up to schools to feed their children, have had social service workers and buildings dictate how they move, how they exist, whether they have economic opportunity. That's not my day-to-day lived experience. And for the majority of us on this call, that's not our day-to-day experience. We don't worry about our access to food. We don't worry about our ability to have safe housing. We don't worry about the prevalence of walking down the street and whether you're safe. And when we are looking at proximity to harm, right, to the ongoing harm, because the call for reparations is not just about closing the wealth gap, it's about stopping the harm that is happening in the Black community, right? The fact that here in Oakland, we are still burying children who are lacking the opportunity to have dreamed and had success in a different kind of way. I'm not as directly impacted, but it's possible for me to be impacted. It's possible for me to have a proximity to that harm, but it is not harm to me directly. So I do think that we all have harm in this process, and I try to center us on that. But I also think how we repair that harm requires us to look at proximity and who is directly impacted. I want to lift up that there's so much amazing work in Oakland going on. And I think that as you kind of step back and you look at the overall demand, we're really asking as a movement across multiple organizations for a dialogue around the experience, the lived experience that families are having, that Black students are having, that our community is having, and an authentic acknowledgement between all of us that we can do this. Idea of stopping harm and repairing harm, and investing in the opportunities necessary for success once we all are able to move as one. And so that is also part of the demand for reparations. We have to move in a unified front.
Thank you for sharing that, Pacolia. There were so many words of wisdom in there. I'm just kind of processing, and a lot of what you shared, I really appreciate what you shared about thinking about proximity to harm. I think that's a really important part of the conversation, and it makes me hopeful that as people think about solutions for reparations, we can use like a both and framing. Perhaps there's like, visionary long-term goals that promote healing for everyone, but to your point, also that acknowledges the more like short-term or immediate need for people to have closer proximity to the harm being done as well. So thank you so much, Pacolia, for offering that. We will now shift a little bit to a different view. So that was a wonderful view of what's happening locally, here in the Bay Area, in Oakland, on the ground in real time. We'd also like to hear from Jesse from the National, want to make sure I get it right, Community Reinvestment Coalition, and kind of shift gears a bit to thinking about the financial sector and the historical legacy that banks and financial institutions have played in redlining. Jesse, in your career, you champion fair and responsible banking policies, which have resulted in nearly $192 billion in new investments in low and moderate income communities through community benefits agreements with 12 different banking institutions. And that is an enormous amount of money, I must say. I can't even really fathom what $192 billion worth of money could do. And we know that banks have played a key role in directly and indirectly enabling and promoting redlining. From your perspective, what responsibility do banks and the broader financial services sector have in addressing that lasting economic legacy of slavery and structural racism?
Well, I think they have a big role to play, and they have a big role to play because they've had a big role in both the history and the ongoing discrimination against people of color, ongoing inequality. I just want to break down for a minute kind of just how I think about this. I think a lot of people in the past year have become really aware of the challenges that in particular Black people face, but that people of color face, as they go through everyday life. All of the impediments, the discrimination, the systemic unfairness that people of color experience. If I think about life as sort of like a race, and it's a fact that Black and brown people in running the race, it's as if there's hurdles on the track, right, that you have to jump over. But there's also a whole history of discrimination, a history of robbing wealth from Black people, from people of color, going back to slavery and Jim Crow and segregation. And this is a history, I think, that's still not well understood by a lot of people, and the impact of hundreds of years of robbing the wealth from a group of people and preventing them from accumulating wealth, and the impact it has on life today. So not only are Black and brown people jumping over hurdles as they run, they're also starting 100 yards back on the track. And I think it's important to analyze that, because it's important to understand that you have to address both. You could remove some of the hurdles and Black and brown people would still be starting 100 yards back. You could move them forward and help them start, at the same place, and they'd still be experiencing the hurdles. And so when we talk about addressing the racial wealth gap, when we talk about addressing racism, I think we have to talk both about the historical harm, the very specific things that banks, the government, and other actors did. And banks participated in the financing of slavery. They accepted slaves as capital for financing plantations and other operations. But they also have played a role ongoing in preventing access to capital and credit, which is critical for the process of wealth building. You can't buy a house, most people, without taking out a loan and owning a home, starting a business. These are the kinds of activities that generate wealth for most people. So I like to talk about the credit score as one example of just how this intersection of historical discrimination and ongoing discrimination works. We know that credit scores are imperfect, that they don't take into account certain things. They don't take into account, for example, on-time rental payments from people living in rental housing as evidence of their ability to pay their bills on time. That's unfair. That should be changed. But it's also important to note, this is where I think the conversation sometimes doesn't go deep enough, that a credit score in general is pretty predictive of risk. A person with a 580 credit score is more likely to default on debt than a person with a 780 credit score. But why is that? When you dig into that, so there's a lot of conversation. We work with a lot of banks about how do we design a better credit score? How do we underwrite better to really take into account how risky a person is, so we can expand access. What we don't get to is the fact that some people have a low credit score because they have low wealth, and they have low wealth because of a history of hundreds of years of robbing of a group of people's wealth, of taking away their wealth, of preventing them from accumulating it. And so when you start life with very little wealth, personally, but also in your family network, you don't have anybody to rely on when life happens, when you lose your job, when you have a health issue, when you go through divorce, you get injured. When life happens and you're a low wealth person in a low wealth family, you're going to default on your credit obligations. You might not be able to make a payment on time, and you're going to have a lower credit score. And so you're going to be a riskier borrower. But it's deeply unfair. It's deeply racist. It represents and bakes into the credit score hundreds of years of discrimination. And what tends to happen is people tend to focus then on, sort of a low credit score as an individual pathology. Oh, what's needed is education. What's needed is financial literacy. We got to intervene to help someone who doesn't understand how to manage their credit, who doesn't understand how to pay their bills on time. When the reality is, when you dig into it, for a lot of people, fundamentally, it's not that they're irresponsible with their money. It's that they started life at a real disadvantage. They started at 100 yards behind some of us. And as they ran life, they were jumping over hurdles. And so we have to recognize that in our interventions. It's one of the reasons why in our work, as we work on home ownership, as we work on small business, we came to the view that we had to support economic reparations, that we had to support solving the historic harm that was perpetrated against people, that we had to address the racial wealth divide, even as we also address policies that make it easier to run the race, as we remove the hurdles, that we have to do both of those things, or we're not going to get very far, because people are starting with very little wealth. And so when they go through life, it's that much more difficult to build it. And it's not a result of individual pathology or individual behavior. It's a result of hundreds of years of discrimination. And then the fact that they're running the race with obstacles and hurdles in the way that we also need to address. And banks have a big role to play in all of this. Banks can play a role in removing the hurdles, but also in redressing the harm. That's what something like the Community Reinvestment Act is. It's an obligation to reinvest in community, to address that historic harm. The problem is it needs to be focused on race. It needs to be focused on the racial wealth divide. It needs to be focused on communities that were redlined and specifically harmed. 75% of communities that were redlined during the 1930s are today in poverty. So we see the intergenerational impact of these policies of robbing of people's wealth. And we've done studies that show public health outcomes are worse in these neighborhoods. Educational outcomes are worse in these neighborhoods. These things are all connected and related and historic and present. And we have to analyze and dissect it that way.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And a technical question we had for you that kind of builds upon what you just shared was, as advocates, how can we better incentivize these banks to pay into endowments, perhaps for victims of redlining, or to pay into, to create funds to really directly support Black families? And do you feel like there's a balance between a mandating and regulation tactic where government would have to intervene versus really partnering with banks to create those agreements?
Yeah, I think you need both. Again, I think the Community Reinvestment Act should be changed to be explicitly race focused, race conscious. And there's ways to do that. I think it's important that we develop an obligation, recognizing that there was a historic harm. I also think it's important, change comes when people change. And it's important to partner with the leaders of these institutions to solve the problem, but also to help them with their understanding of the problem. Again, I think in the last year or two, a lot of people have really had a transformational experience when it comes to understanding race in America. A lot of white people have had that kind of experience. I don't know that they really understand the full history. I think for some people, maybe they know something about slavery, but they don't really know that even though we didn't have slavery, when you look at Jim Crow, when you look at segregation, that when it comes to wealth accumulation, things were just as bad and continued, in many cases up to the present day. And so I do think that the value of partnering is to bring people along in how they understand the nature of the problem, how they understand the history, and how they understand what it's going to take to dismantle it. So I do think, when we engage with banks as funders, when we engage with banks as lenders, they can make a meaningful impact on these problems and in partnership. But the partnership also has to change how people understand the nature of the problem. It has to move and shift. Very powerful purveyors of capital in this country to really dig in and understand the history and the impact differently.
Absolutely. And one additional question for you, Jesse. So an idea that was proposed by one of our partner organizations as an example policy just to think about implementing in California was to require that banks create plans themselves to reverse the impacts of redlining in the communities that they serve. In your opinion, what do you think about a concept or an idea like that of really putting the onus and the responsibility on the banks to design those metrics and strategies? And have you seen anything like that happening in your work already?
Yeah, I think, we see an example of that at a broad level. I mean, CRA and the kinds of community benefits agreements that we do are designed, in the macro, in the aggregate, to get at those kinds of issues. The problem is, where we haven't gotten to is to the really specific, is to, as you said, a real plan, thinking about neighborhoods, thinking about cities, thinking about very particular and very specific metrics for how you address the harm that was caused by redlining. And I think what we see again is, many banks' CRA activities are broadly focused on low and moderate income, and not as directly focused on the harm and repairing the harm of redlining. It's not race focused in every instance, and perhaps there's not a deep enough engagement to really dig in a neighborhood context and move the needle. Say, what would it take to transform this neighborhood and these people that were harmed? And so I do think we need to get to that level of commitment, that level of focus, and that level of requirement and obligation as we think about what it's going to take. We did a study, Kelsey, just to take Black home ownership to 60%, which is not what it is for white people. And it would take tripling the number of first-time home buyers, Black home buyers, in a year, and then doing that for 20 years before you would get to 60% Black home ownership. So the hill is steep, and it's going to take real specific efforts in the way that you described to climb it.
Steep indeed. Thank you for sharing that statistic. That is really astounding to think about. And I think that's an important one to kind of ground us in the magnitude of this issue. Thank you, Jesse, for sharing those remarks. We look forward to thinking through ways to partner with you all on our shared work. We'd also love to now invite Michaelia to the conversation to take another kind of macro step back and think about the role that foundations and philanthropy can play in partnering with other sectors on this topic. Michaelia, in your current role as a program director of the Inclusive Economies Program, you oversee a $9.2 million grant-making portfolio. And to share with the audience, previously as Director of Corporate Giving at Prudential Financial, you also managed over $10 million in national and place-based grants. And we would like to acknowledge, and I think at Greenlining, we definitely think that the importance of nonprofits and community-based organizations in doing a lot of the work on the ground with social justice is so important. So we're really grateful for the philanthropic community for having that equity lens to their work as well, often. And a question for you, so how does the philanthropic community play a role in pushing forward this growing movement towards racial equity and explicitly closing the racial wealth gap? And do you think it could be more directly related to reparations in the conversations that you're having?
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you to Greenlining for inviting us to this conversation. I think that there are, I have to start by acknowledging, in many ways, the point that we are now in this conversation builds off of a lot of work that has happened to date. So if you think about what philanthropy has invested in years past, we have supported, for example, cash transfer programs. We have support that have been researched by groups like MBRC and others that have, and all the way up to now where we've talked about programs like universal basic income. And so there is a precedent that we can build on where we have investments that have driven capital directly into the hands of community. And they all kind of demonstrate a few similar findings, which is that is generally a good thing for people. Giving people money is generally a good thing. So I think we have to start by acknowledging that there's some precedent. I also want to just acknowledge that there's some collective knowledge in the philanthropic space of leaders who have been doing this work for a long time. So Edgar Villanueva at Liberated Capital and the work he has been doing around decolonizing wealth is a perfect example of how philanthropy can directly name and give funds towards reparations. There are also other philanthropic serving groups like the Neighborhood Funders Group, Edge Funders, Justice Funders. There are lots of foundations that have been doing really incredible work to think about how are we directly putting capital to work. And to a point that Jesse raised about addressing, reparations is about, should be about both and, which is like removing the barriers and then helping address the inequity, like getting people to the same starting line, right? And I fundamentally believe that a part of philanthropic capital is to be solution seeking, right? And so therefore, we have to be willing to invest in things that are across a spectrum of risk. And the reason for that is because we're solving for something that hasn't been solved for, which means we're going to have to do something that we may not have done before, which may make us a little uncomfortable. And I think that if we don't do that, right, we're going to see what we have now, which this session was about the racial wealth gap as well, the connection between reparations and the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is the same as it was in 1968. And philanthropy has done nothing but grow over the last several decades. And so what does that tell us, right? Like in 2021, I think in 2020 rather, Investopedia said that the number of billionaires in the United States, we added 56 new billionaires in the US compared to like 21 in 2020 and 2018. That's huge. In a year where people were losing their jobs, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with racial tensions, we triple, I'm not even going to try to do the numbers. I'll leave that to Jesse, but like the number of billionaires just grew exponentially. And so while we're trying to solve for the racial wealth gap, we have to also acknowledge there are structural factors that are allowing that gap to persist. And so therefore, when we think about reparations, I think philanthropy has to think about how we can use our dollars to address the structural levers that will change that trajectory, right? And so we think a lot about making sure that we're investing in the ownership of assets and capital, right? Not just thinking about income strategies, but the ownership of actual capital. We think a lot about how we seed power and decision making. So I think Pacolia was talking about, there's a budget that's managed in a city that's supposed to be directed to supporting, better outcomes in Black communities that is being stripped from their reach, from their ability to have voice, from their ability to have power. And so we have to start to seed power in communities to actually make some decisions, right? To make sure that they're benefiting Black communities. And also making sure that we are providing voice to these issues and supporting advocacy around them, because this is a long-term journey. I mean, when we think about reparations that the United States enacted with the Japanese, following in their experience in internment camps. We have a precedent all the way from there to here we are now. And this is a long-term conversation that's been happening. And so when I think about the work of folks like Sandy Darity and the work he has been doing to really do some deep analysis, and there's going to be, I think, a great report coming out soon where they actually categorize and talk about different package costs. Philanthropy should start to how we socialize those things, how we intersect them across different industries, where we're actually addressing those systemic barriers that both Jesse and Pacolia talked about in their remarks as well.
Yes, I'm loving your passion and your enthusiasm, I must say, Michaelia, if I may just offer that. And so thank you for that. And you mentioned a few different interventions, cash payments, universal basic income. I've also heard you express different ideas around supporting small businesses and entrepreneurship. I'm curious, in your role in working in philanthropy and seeing a lot of different types of interventions and strategies at the community level, are there a couple that you feel most inspired by or hopeful for that could be viewed as a form of reparations?
Absolutely. And I want to say a couple of things. So I use the universal basic income as an example of precedent where we have actually done cash transfers and given people money. I don't want to conflate that with reparations. I think that they're different tools that could be used that are complementary and related, but should be used in different ways. Because when we're talking about reparations, I want to reinforce points that were made by my colleague speakers that we're reconciling harm. We're reconciling harm explicitly, and universal basic income is broader than that. It's about a shift that's happening in our economy and how we compensate people as humans to live dignified lives, right? So I don't want to conflate those things, but they're related. But I think in terms of interventions, I also have to be very careful. So I'm recognizing we're up on time, and then I also have to be careful that in the role of philanthropy, it is an incredibly privileged role because you get to meet incredibly smart people and leaders, all of whom I would love to fund if I had. If Melinda French would like to hire me as her philanthropic advisor, I'd love to do that if I had more money. But I can't fund all those folks. So I don't want to pretend that I'm playing favorites. I'm just calling out some things that are great. So I'm just giving that caveat. There is actually really interesting work happening, right? So I think in the partners that we work with, there are groups of folks that are actually working to seed power in economic decision making. So Transform Finance actually put together a wonderful report that actually catalogs a number of case studies where in local investment decisions, community groups they have power. And so that's an intervention that philanthropy should support, which is like putting people at the table to be in decision-making processes around economic development. And that report is a great catalog of some of those. There's also like work that's happening around capital. But we live in a capitalist society. Like we're not going to get away from that, right? And even though there are lots of efforts to amend how capitalism works in this country, it's central to how we operate. And I think there are groups that are trying to find ways to make that work for Black folks and for other communities of color. And so I want to call out folks that are doing work around ownership of assets in real estate space. So the Inclusive Capital Collective recently put out a Black paper, as opposed to white paper, focused on real estate strategies that really look at how you build the right capital stack and different types of capital stacks to support community ownership of commercial space and residential space, which I think is really powerful. There's research, and I think that is built off of research that folks like Andre Perry has done around the devaluation of Jesse talked about home ownership. Even when Black folks own homes, they're devalued at a higher rate than white folks, right? So it's like we still need interventions in those spaces. And I think some of those models that are really driving different forms of ownership matter there. I'll also call out, there's work that's being done in the entrepreneurship space, groups like 1863 Ventures and Common Future, and several in the Boston Impact Initiative to really think about, how are we making sure that the financial products that we are giving folks access to in communities of color aren't super extractive. And there are funders that have been doing exceptional work in this space. I'll call out the Katali Foundation and the Center for Cultural Innovation, and a few others that have really been putting their money where their mouth is, where they're making statements around investing in community. And I've been taking a lot of think all philanthropy should do the same.
Amazing, amazing. And thank you, Michaelia, for also acknowledging that we've arrived at this moment because of all of the work from previous generations and people really moving the needle towards more social justice. And so I really appreciate you grounding us in that as well and sharing these amazing examples. I'm looking forward to looking up some of these organizations, to keeping in touch with you three as well. I hope we all continue to keep in touch and learn more about each other's work and how we can all work towards making reparations a reality in our respective interest areas. And this was just a wonderful chat. I appreciate you, Pacolia, Jesse, and Michaelia for taking the time to speak with us at Greenlining and our audience. I hope people are feeling energized and ready to work on these issues. And I hope that you three also get some time for rest and relaxation and self-care as well. So just thank you all so much. This was wonderful.